welcome back everybody for another DePIN Masterminds. I've got Brandon Baker here with me from Conduit again. And I just feel like we didn't have enough time last week to finish up all of our thoughts. We talked about a lot of things, but I think we ended, so maybe we start with what we ended, which was the concept of alignment in a value chain. And you said that the goal is focusing on the outcome and how everybody can align their interests in that value chain toward that outcome. Is that a correct summary, like a top level, if you were to give our last discussion a topic, would it be that alignment of incentives for an outcome?
And I think we'd also, in the last one, got into reward systems a bit and mechanically how those work, which are all, economies. We don't think of reward system as that, but they are. They have all the mechanisms, mechanics, and outcomes of economies. So, but yeah, I would agree. I think any time in any setting that you can get people aligned to an outcome, you're going to reduce friction, increase output, likely generate more value, and have prosperity. And so if you can do that in an economy, it's exponential. And the profound impacts onto society are incredible as well. So I think these are all things that you and I have talked about it. Like, these are things that Web3 as a whole should be looking at and seriously considering. Is I think we get over the top focused on technology. Like, really easy, right? You got a bunch of brilliant technologists running around. But the intersection that Web3 actually plays and where it touches has a lot to do with other industries, specifically economics. And I would even say, and I think we get hyper-focused in finance when we talk about DeFi, but I want to elevate it up even further, which is into economics. And I think if you can start to play in all those realms, get the right people at the table that are experts in their area, then you can start to say, what's the right design, but then also there's also a cause and effect to every decision that we make. And so we can make a technological decision that has profound impact on, economies. And was that the intended outcome, right? Again, go to outcome, right? So yeah.
Well, and yeah, I mean, we can go down a rabbit hole of, I think of the story of the, what was it, the cobras in India when the British came in and they were like, oh, we're going to incentivize people by paying them for every dead cobra they bring us, with the intent of getting rid of the cobras that were bugging everybody. What ended up happening is people started farming cobras and bringing them to the British for the payment. And the British were like, well, wait a second, that wasn't the deal. And they stopped paying them. And then everybody was just like, fine, we're just gonna let these cobras go. And you ended up with more cobras than you had in the beginning. And so I sometimes think about that in the context of this technology. It's like, swapping algorithms or automated market making algorithms. Such a cool idea and concept. It super simplifies a lot of what we do with order book trading. You're really only keeping track of a few variables instead of a whole bunch of orders, which is really cool. I think that's elegant. But then we don't always understand what the unintended consequences are, especially when people can start 10x leveraging whatever they have there, and they have these incredibly fast and efficient markets. And we end up with projects that fail because of it. And a lot of people that might have lost a lot of money or value in that process. So I agree. I mean, thinking about, what's that?
I said, or let's take liquid staking.
How so?
Well, the unintended consequences, right? Like, essentially you're taking an asset that should be securing the underlying chain through a staking protocol, and you're allowing that to be essentially creating a derivative, which fundamentally breaks down the strength of the underlying asset. And so this, like, by definition, this is exactly what happened in 2008 with the default crisis. It was paper on paper on paper. Well, the same thing's happening.
Right.
right? And then I would say, to your point, exponentially increased, because what you're having is people moving this asset in a liquid way into even higher risk variable assets. So it's not a compound on real estate, which clearly imploded. It's a whole nother magnitude of volatility. And I'm just like, well, then what's the point? If you're going to do that, then why are you claiming that the staking is to secure the network? Because it no longer is. It's not doing that.
Well, and we can get into a whole discussion about staking as well. I mean, there's there's multiple arguments here of how staking could or should work to secure a network. One of them is you're putting something at risk to create a security in the network, right? You're locking something up that if your participation in that consensus fails, or your participation in that network's function fails, then you're going to get slashed. You're going to lose some value, right? That's the objective of that kind of staking. Hedera, for example, had a different type of staking where they said we have 50 billion tokens and we only need 2/3 of those tokens to be assigned to nodes that participate in consensus to calculate consensus. So they didn't even have to have an address book, for example. They didn't need to know who was in the network. All they needed to know was who is contributing to consensus and what is the total sum of the stake pointed at that consensus node. Now, what they did is they said every 24 hours, we're going to take a snapshot, and that becomes your staking value for the next 24 hours. And then you can spend it however you want. So it wasn't locked up and there was no burning. If you're a normal account holder, you can actually proxy your stake to a Hedera consensus node. And then every 24 hours, you got a snapshot and it would go, cool. That node now has, 5% of the total stake of the network. That's a good chunk of the way there to the 2/3 requirement. And then you could go and just spend your money throughout the day. And that was fine. And then the next day it would go, oh, you have less money in your account, which means that node now has a smaller stake in the consensus. And so they did it differently, which I get why they were doing it. They were doing it for a mathematical reason. There really wasn't any economic risk in staking. If anything, there was only economic upside in the staking side. And I was okay with that model. I think liquid staking is a little bit different, or restaking, as some people are using. When we think about like rehypothecation, right? That's a standard practice in the traditional trade industry and financial industry. But rehypothecation comes with lots of regulatory oversight.
Well, and it becomes with a massive amount of risk underwriting. Like the amount of mathematical quantification of risk in those products is incredible, right? And this is my actual concern, is that no one's actually quantifying. I haven't seen it like mathematically at a level that I would be comfortable quantifying the actual risk and playing the scenarios out and running, regression analysis and actuaries on literally what's going to happen to this risk profile here, right? And so we're playing, it feels as if we've got a little bit of nuclear weapons here, that we don't know what we're playing with. And there's not enough time that's taken into consideration of playing out scenarios. And on top of it, you have individuals participating, right? Yeah. So there's like this mandate of like, okay, if you're going to work around and kind of subvert, whether you do it on purpose or not, some of the regulatory process, and you're claiming that there's too much friction, so you're going to okay, great. Then the people that are designing this need to do the right thing and take a little bit more of a forefront approach into quantifying risks, so that we can turn around and communicate that to people. Like, hey, here is the risk here, right? You can do it, but this is what's happening.
Yeah, well, and if we look at crypto as the sandbox for the next generation of fintech, then I think it's fair what's happening in the crypto space. For it to become the next, to actually become fintech, it's going to have to go through a lot of this maturing that you're talking about. Yep. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to say, listen, we've got this great technology. We've got, near 15 years or maybe a little over 15 years of technological development in this cryptocurrency, blockchain, DLT space. And we've been playing in a sandbox, and those who join the sandbox sometimes lose their toys. Yep. And other people walk away with more toys because we didn't have good controls or mature controls built into the system. I think people are trying to do that. I see a lot of that. And this is, we don't have to go down the psychological or the sociological components of crypto, but
wait. It's interesting you say that though, Ken, because one of the biggest factors of economics is behavioral science. Isn't that interesting?
This is true. Well, I know, and I get it too.
Go ahead. We don't have to go down there. It's just interesting. Like
this is a very small subset of the global user base.
Yeah.
That have a very specific behavior in this space. Like, I would argue that a lot of people actually value that gambling component. They value the potential upside with the high risk, right? And that's fine. There are plenty of people in the financial industries who are day trading in, small cap or penny stocks at what would be relatively higher risk investments. And they're free to do that as adults. They can make that decision. I think that's the libertarian argument. That's the libertarian side of me. That's just like, let people screw themselves over. They can put out as much rope as they want to hang themselves with. That's fine.
As long as things are done in deceit. So if they know the risk, and you're right, and that's their choice. Like, oh, that's on you. It's when things are done deceitful and perception is lower risk than what it actually is. That I have a major problem with that.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that's a problem in all kinds of industries. I mean, anytime you have an industry, you have that in traditional advertising, that problem of deceit. And I mean, you have that problem in advertising settlement. If you just look at the ad tech side of things, where you've got a supply and demand side of the business model, if you will, which I think is interesting. Like, the supply side of advertising is you, and the demand side is the advertisers. That tells you a little bit about how that business is structured.
Yep.
But either way, like, there's not a lot of transparency. And sometimes what happens is you can think of it as like restaking or rehypothecation or liquid staking of ad inventory. So people are reselling eyeballs and advertisements, and maybe there's not as much transparency for the person who's actually paying for the advertisement.
Yeah.
So anyway, my point being is, like, I think that's just something, anytime there's money involved, I think we're going to see that. The question is, how do we mitigate that as much as possible? And what are some technological controls we can put in place to help to mitigate that? And I think that's ideally the argument with smart contracts is go look at the code, right? You can audit the code yourself if you wanted to. How many people in the crypto space do you think are qualified to audit smart contract code? I can read the code, but maybe I'm not going to catch some things in there that would be unusual, that look pretty usual to me, right? Especially now that we're adding lots of proxy layers in smart contracts. Even somebody who's savvy is probably potentially going to miss some vector of attack. And this happens all the time.
You're also talking about reactive state versus proactive. What you just mentioned was a reactive, like, go look at it likely after the fact of what something happened, versus the ability to be more proactive in what we're doing. So that's also another paradigm that we also have to bring in. It's like, okay, it's one thing that, yes, we can go audit every single thing and see what happened. How do we start to move into a state that is more proactive in avoiding circumstances? And not all of them. I'm not talking about a utopian, like everything is that's not what I'm referring to. Risk is all about mitigation.
Yep.
Right. So even taking one step in a proactive step is a exponential movement. Well, especially if you're talking about at an economy level, right? That has orders of magnitude effect by a small change.
Right.
So, but yeah, that would be another thing with to your point of audit. How many people can actually do it? Even if they can do it, are they doing it in a reactive state? Likely, right? So that means whatever's happened has already happened.
Yep. We've got our normal DePIN Crypto Network and Tony joining us as well. Just so you know, I'm just looking at the Twitter chat on here as well. And so we got a few people who've joined us. So if anybody has any questions or anything you want to add to this, feel free to drop it in chat, either in LinkedIn, in YouTube, or in Twitter. And if I see it, I'll pop it up and we'll incorporate that into our discussion. But thanks everybody for joining. This is awesome. Yeah, we've got DePIN Crypto. We're going to steal up another hour of your life here. So, yeah, Smiley Girl's bringing up the point of you could also address responsibility. Each investor has a personal responsibility as well as the project. And I think that's, again, the libertarian side of the culture of crypto, right? So we allow people the opportunity to screw themselves over. I think that there is a consumer protection concern there. And this is probably the biggest thing I hear from regulators, is everything is hinged on consumer protection. And as much as we would like to keep regulators out of our crypto business, as soon as you are on or off ramping value, they're involved, whether we like it or not. And at that point, when I talk to regulators, a lot of them are really excited about the technology. And I'm in Sacramento, right? Sacramento, we've got farmers and politicians. That's what we've got in Sacramento. And so for all of California, so the 7th largest economy in the world, some would say the 5th, depends on which politician you're talking to.
Yep.
But we've got one of the largest economies in the world in California, and in Sacramento, I get a lot of opportunity to speak with regulators, either at the DFPI, which is Department for Financial Protection and Innovation, by the way. They're actually excited to see how this technology could help them prevent fraud, right? So but I went to that conference 2 Wednesdays ago, which DFPI was very heavily involved with here in Sacramento at Sac State. And we had there was a whole panel that was like the balance between consumer protection and innovation. And the entire discussion was about consumer protection. Like nobody talked once about innovation until I was like, so I've heard a lot about consumer protection. What are we doing from the innovation side to allow things to operate more smoothly? And I think it's really just a matter of knowledge, of awareness. Like, I don't know that anybody in that space really understands what the potential is. What are the opportunities? And you and I had a little bit of a chance to talk about that this last week. And I'm going to kind of point to one of your blog articles that you guys put out on the 17th, I think it was, where you talk about the various components of the internet. And one of them was accounting. I think one of them was identity. One of them was finance. I can't remember all of them. You might remember them off the top of your head. But we're making accounting a first-class citizen in the stack, to me, resonates really well. Because I know in blockchain, we basically say you can account for whatever you want to program to account for, right? And there's no accountability in that accounting, right? Accountability meaning that there's almost always a single entry mechanism. There's almost never double entry accounting going on in blockchain. And what I mean by that is that anytime value is added, value is removed from somewhere else. We have to account for that value movement in the real world. Like that has to just happen. And we're just so used to in crypto being like, well, we got 50 billion tokens and now we're going to do some airdrops and now we've got some value, right? But I like the approach that you guys are taking with regard to making accounting a fundamental mechanism and like really pinning it to traditional accounting practices. And we did talk about a little bit about this last week, but I want to dig a little bit more into that. Like, we talk a lot about identity, right, in the crypto space, because we want to have sovereignty, which I think we all agree is necessary. We want to, meaning we own our own data, right? We control and own our data, and we can share our identity credentials at our choice and also revoke access to those credentials according to our will, right? So identity is one that is big because it's also closely tied to credentials, to cryptography, right? And people want to be able to prove identity attributes through credentials. And even if I just want to say my identity is ownership of this account ID, like we at least need to be able to prove that using cryptography. So identity is a core piece of cryptocurrency, blockchain, DLT.
And Ken, would you agree that it goes hand in hand with authority? And identity and authority are not the same thing either. Those are two different.
You're going to jump into a little bit deeper topic here.
Oh, I'm losing your audio.
Are you losing my audio?
It's back. Hey.
Okay. Who knows what's going on with I need to like redo my whole system here. I just need to like unplug everything and plug everything back in.
So. It might have been me, but I wonder if anybody else caught that. You just faded for a bit.
Well, and I was just saying that like when we talk about authority, we're actually talking about another step, I would say, even on top of identity. Deep in saying too much gaming, just all my gears getting worn down from all the gaming. That's true. That's not wrong. I was up way too late playing Elden Ring last night, and so I might have sabotaged my health for the next couple of days. Um, so let's talk about what you mean by authority, because identity is who I am. What is authority?
Authority is what rights you have.
Hmm.
And you can move rights independent of your identity.
Yep.
Right? So all of the rights that I have within that identity, the rights could also change given the category of identity. So let me go further. A corporation versus an individual, a natural person, right? So like there's two different and I don't want to go deep here, but I want to give different paradigms that is like makes up this incredible matrix that all has to be accounted for in the correct way. And so who are you as in what entity and what identity do you have? Then under that, what rights do you have?
Right.
And then within those rights, are they rights that can be subdivided? Are there rights that can be split or given to someone else? As in, does Ken grant me, Brandon, the natural person, the right to do something on his behalf?
So taking that concept, though, this is something that we talked about in the Inner Work Alliance, where we worked on the token taxonomy framework, right? And this was 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago. So this is like not anything new in the crypto space. But this was before NFTs as collectibles was a thing. And I remember we worked so hard on figuring out how to encapsulate rights and liabilities into tokens. And this included both fungible and non-fungible tokens. Tokens, there's a plethora of token derivatives, right? And we came up with a whole formulation of like how to formulaically identify or define a token. And fungible and non-fungible is just like one of the core properties of a token, right? But you could have delegable, right? Which is what you're talking about. Is like, can I delegate this token? You can have encumberable. Can something encumber my token's rights, or can you prevent me from transferring it because of some encumbrance on it, right? Whether I owe
Revocable
you
versus
money.
irrevocable.
Revocable, irrevocable, divisible, non-divisible, fractional, so all of these different properties that we define in the token taxonomy framework, which is part of the Ethereum Foundation's.
By the way, Ken, this is not a Web3 thing. This is illegal. This is our legal system. This is where this comes from, is the division of rights, obligations, and authority. Like,
yep. And that was the perspective that we were taking, because we had companies like Microsoft on the Inner Work Alliance who are like, listen, we know how to do authorization and authentication, right? We know how to do these things. How do we do this in a token model where we could move these rights and obligations around, and also do it in a way where we can have shared rights and obligations, divisible or partial rights and obligations? So we had all of these discussions about what that can be. And I remember at the time me thinking like, oh my goodness, this is revolutionary. Like this is where NFTs are going to go, right? This is, in my mind, I was like, ooh, this is where it's going to be. And people were like, oh, we're going to do art on NFTs. And I'm just like real life art, you're not going to be able to do in NFTs. Like the digital twin model wasn't strong enough at the time.
yep,
So it's just like, how are you going to link physical art with a digital token?
yep.
They're like, no, we're going to start with digital art. And I thought, like pictures? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, nobody's going to buy pictures. Why would you do pictures with NFTs? I was totally wrong, because a year later it became the hottest thing. But I just remember at the time
The
thinking, like,
hottest
we
thing
have
that
much
died as
better.
fast as it went up. Just so we're clear.
But that's fair. Everything's in cycles, right? And now we've got a whole use case for PFPs, right? And I actually love the community aspect of it. Like Dead Pixels on Hedera. I love the Dead Pixels project. They have the coolest ghosts, or Peculiar Peeps. I love those projects that have a very optimistic community building
Sure.
value to it, right? At the time, I didn't understand it, though. At the very beginning, I'm just like, nobody's going to buy digital art. And you're correct. Like the speculation cycle went up and dropped. And that's fine. But I don't think the community component's going away. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to see more of that community component being built in with things like NFTs, whether they're actually NFTs, actually smart contracts, actually Solidity code running on EVMs or some other mechanism.
Yep.
We're going to see that. But the point being is like my first expectation with NFTs was like, we're going to do authorization with NFTs. Like that was my first thought, was like, how do we do authority, right? How do we issue rights using NFTs? And I was thinking about like, revenue sharing rights,
Yep.
building access rights. Could you scan your phone and now get access to my building? And can I revoke that as an employer or as a property manager? Can I revoke that access right?
Yep. All your
And so,
ACLs, all your like literally everything.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, and like you said, ACLs are not a new thing. It's been
No,
around for years. It's just, how do we do this in a way where the tracking is not controlled by a central authority who has the key to the kingdom?
that's
Right.
it.
And I think that's the trick, is because we can solve a whole lot of problems with centralized solutions. And that's part of what we're trying to figure out, is how do we do the same thing at the same performance without any friction, while also not having a central authority or somebody who has the keys to the kingdom, who could just arbitrarily just say, sorry, I don't like you. I'm the admin, or I'm a disgruntled IT employee, and I'm just going to like suddenly shut down everybody's building access.
Yep.
It's like, well, you didn't have the right keys or didn't go through the right process or whatever the case may be. And I may be pushing too hard on the decentralized model here. I think there's plenty that can be solved with centralized solutions today, and probably are solved significantly more, are solved more significantly more efficiently. And the trick is, how do we do this without adding friction and at the same efficiency level? And I think that's
Or
where,
greater.
so adding value while reducing friction, and at very minimum maintaining the user experience, if not improving it.
Yep.
Right. And I think that's where your project and my project action was like, Ken is describing Reddit mods. They get offended by something and then just like, boom, you're no longer available. You're no longer here. All your comments are gone. Yeah, it's yeah, Reddit's weird. Reddit's
It
like,
is.
theoretically it's decentralized in the sense that you have multiple mods, but every mod has the authority to just like kill everything, and they're all just very emotionally driven. So it's weird. It's like it's built to be like a decentralized governance. It's built with that. So again, this is unintended consequences, right? It was built to be like a committee or a group of mods that could control a community. And what it turned into is every one of them now becomes a central authority. It's
Correct.
like a leaky boat. Any one of them, if any one of them gets offended, you're screwed. So it's
With
like,
with
it's
with,
weird
with,
the other way around.
with a very tenuous process to revoke and move authority, authorization, rights back around.
Oh yeah.
Right. And then that's part of that's part of the problem here. Look, this is not an easy thing. You and I have talked about this. This is not an easy thing, but it has incredible widespread impact. And then if we talk about the bigger notions of what we're all trying to solve in Web3, I'm not sure how we get to the actual fruition of what people, when we dream about a future state of what I think tenets that people are marching towards. I don't know how we don't do it if we don't actually solve this the correct way. And in many of the things that I'm seeing out there, like we could have an entire session here, Ken, talking about tokenization and how it will never work in the current way. Why? Because they're not dealing with rights and obligations, period. And fundamentally, if you're going to have assets and moving them around with derivatives or any other setting, you have to be able to separate the rights. So creating a digital twin and a representation of an asset on it as a token does nothing. It literally serves no purpose. In fact, you're adding friction yet again, because the process is that you still have to identify who the rights owners are at what point in the movement of that asset. And we don't have ledgers that can do that today.
Well, I mean, couldn't you write an EIP that captures all of that logic that you're talking about? Couldn't you have an Ethereum improvement proposal that becomes, because I know that we've got a number of them out there that have to do with rights and obligations. They might be very rudimentary and not mature, but like, couldn't we capture what you're talking about in those technologies today?
Okay, so let's take this next step. So you do that, you still have an issue at the ledger level.
Meaning?
Well, let's go back to double accounting.
Okay.
Like you still have a breakdown in the process. So let's zoom back out and say, okay, the reason we're implementing this, which was what you brought up, is for some either increased value, reduced friction, or sovereignty. And likely what you want to get is all three, right? Like you want the outcome to be all three encompassing. Well, in that situation, you've talked about it. How painful is it to operate in this Web3 world and yet still file taxes, do accounting, and everything else in the traditional? It's awful.
But couldn't you correct that using the existing technology? Couldn't you create double entry accounting in an EVM? Couldn't you?
I don't believe you can.
Why is that?
Those blockchain ledgers and the current existing ledgers, they're not double accounting ledgers. If you were to rewrite the EVM in a temporal database, perhaps.
Well, okay. So I think that there's more an efficiency argument here because I could, coming from half of my team comes from emulation development, right? So
Yep.
My engineering team, they build emulators for video games, right? Of course, the original hardware is going to run the game the way that it was meant to be run.
Sure.
You can emulate that hardware. And back in the days, if you were trying to emulate it, like right now, try emulating a PS5. It's nigh on impossible. You might as well just buy a PS5, right?
Yeah.
But in a few years, we'll have computers that are powerful enough to emulate a PS5. And you can probably do it even today, just with some really costly computers that are significantly more than $700 or $600 or whatever they cost today. But the point being is that for a cost, you can get close to emulating a PS5 today. But tomorrow or in a few years, for probably about the same price, you'll be able to emulate a PS5. And I think that's the same phenomenon we're seeing here is what you're talking about is these very robust accounting systems that have matured over hundreds of years of accounting practices over, at least 200 and something years in the US regulatory ecosystem. And there are bits and pieces in there that we currently don't have implemented. But couldn't we emulate all of that in EVMs? I think for me, I look at that, I'm like, I think we could emulate that. I think we could emulate a double entry accounting system in an EVM. The downside to that is that it would be incredibly expensive. It'd be cost prohibitive, and it would be inefficient in the performance side as well. So I don't think it would be usable. Yeah. I think that's the answer is like, sure, we could do this all in a fully decentralized model. And this is why Conduit gets me excited, right? Because what you're doing is you're taking a lot of the stuff that we're trying to emulate and moving it down into a hardware level with some primitives that encapsulate those fundamental needs. Where an EVM is like, you can think of it as an emulator that doesn't really have anything beyond, core Turing complete primitives, right?
Yep.
Programmable primitives, but it doesn't have accounting primitives built into it. It doesn't have double entry primitives in it. There's a bunch of things it doesn't have. You'd have to build those up. And then the question is, well, why did we do that? Why didn't we just go back and just revamp this thing to have accounting primitives from the beginning? Because I had this design discussion with Hedera internally for years about like, what does a token look like on Hedera? And I think Hedera did some things really well. And I think Hedera made some not so great decisions. It was an argument that we had at times, but we made sure that all of those token taxonomy framework, all of that taxonomy was built in as primitives on Hedera. So you actually have a token that lives on Hedera that has all of these controls and basic features. And then if you want to add any additional programmability, then you would use the EVM, their smart contract layer, to add that. And Algorand kind of did that, and who's Lumens? That was Stellar. Stellar kind of did that. Yeah, like they have these tokens that have fundamental primitives built into the token API, and then they added a layer of programmability on top of it. Algorand added Teal, their transaction execution approval language, which I think was a cool strategy to go with. So I see
if this has been implemented to the fullest extent, why aren't we seeing adoption?
Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why you wouldn't see adoption, and part of it has to do with the on-ramping for the utility token.
Well, I don't know. Let me pose something different. I'm not convinced. I think that's the easy thing that's been said. I'm not convinced that's a problem. So I don't know that this is actually solving issues. Like, I don't know that it's actually the value prop is that great for commerce to move in the setting in which it's ran. So you hit on some things which is inefficient. It's costly. Like, can you actually, do you want to actually save all this down at a chain level? Does it need to be there in that setting? But I'm also sitting here going, like, if it's been solved and the value prop is that great, then why aren't supply chains fully moving over and adopting this and running everything on it? And my proposition is that because of that, whatever the case is, it hasn't been solved. A solution would mean that there would be adoption. A solution would mean there's a value proposition to move people.
All right, so I'm a manufacturer, and I've got my ERP, and my ERP has integrations with the distributors or the wholesalers ERP, and we have some mapping of meaning between our two ERPs, right? So I've got a set, usually, and I come from telco where we dealt in ERPs all the time, right? So, but every organization is going to have their own definition of like what their taxonomy internally looks like. What is the ontology of their system? And then they have to map it to the next person in their supply chain, the next project or company in their supply chain. And where their system, where their processes overlap is where the systems have to map. And that's what they've done. So if you're asking me why nobody in the real world has adopted this en masse, it's because of those intricacies. Every company has their own ERP. They've got their own implementation of an ERP. Some of them are using a Java-based ERP. Some of them are using C-based ERP. They're using different implementations of ERPs. Some of them are using SAP. Some of them are using an Oracle ERP. Like, everybody's using different systems, and they determine where the handoff happens in the business processes between the organizations, and then there becomes a mapping for the important artifacts there as they overlap. A lot of times I think what happens in the Web3 space is we design a solution that we think is going to answer the question, and then we expect everybody just to adopt it instead of going to where they are, right? Go to the ERP and start there and go, what are you guys doing in your ERP? What does that mapping look like? And there have been, I've been in conversations with projects that have looked at that and said, listen, the place where the DLT sits is at the handoff, is in that connection between the two. The question still comes in, how much does this cost and how fast is it? And does it change anything about our current operations? And an example of that would probably be like mobile roaming settlement in Europe. So the TM Forum, we got together and talked with Telefonica and Orange and BT, a bunch of companies out there. And there's currently a middleman. There's a clearinghouse, if you will, that basically takes in requests for settlement. So if I'm roaming on somebody else's network, they're going to figure out which network I came from. They're going to send a settlement request with all of the time and resources I've used on their network. And it's all going through this centralized coordinator. And that's currently what it is. So what this means is you have to have contracts with each other first. Then you all have to have contracts with the clearinghouse. Then you all have to have a technical integration with the clearinghouse. And once you do those 3 steps, you now are integrated. You now can roam on each other's networks. And that's what it takes. Now, the reality is when you set up a telco in Europe now, everybody automatically integrates with that clearinghouse. And then it just becomes a matter of legal contracts between the telcos to say, hey, listen, I'm willing to take roaming from your network. You're willing to take roaming from my network. And now we're already integrated. Like, this is just a default industry standard at this point. But the question that they had is, like, suppose somebody wants to stand up a new telco. Suppose somebody sets up their own telco network. We're talking DePIN here, right? Suppose somebody sets up a Helium or something like that out in the mountains, or somebody sets up a what's Elon Musk's thing? The
Starlink.
Somebody sets up Starlink somewhere, and we set up our own network, our own telco network, or maybe we just set up a bunch of mesh rebroadcasters, right, in some rural parts. But we are compatible on a technical level because we're all talking the same GSM language. But how do we do settlement with people roaming without having the initial legal contract and without having that centralized clearinghouse integration? Like if I'm setting up a network out in,
Why can't you have the legal contract?
no telco is going to talk to me. If I'm a region in the Balkans and I'm just like, hey, we're going to be like, a co-op or a mutual telco, right? We're just going to set something up that we're going to use locally. This is going to be our local telco. But anytime somebody leaves our neighborhood or leaves our region, we want them to be able to still use their phones. And we want anybody who's coming into our region to still be able to use their phones. But nobody knows who we are. We're just a co-op, right? We're a bunch of people who put up a bunch of line of sight towers and a
Yep.
bunch of cell towers. And we just said, okay, we have telephone service now between us, but
Yep.
we want to be able to extend the service on our SIM cards to other networks and have other networks come onto our network. Now, the answer right now is like there's lots of solutions to that now. It's all at the wish and will of the telcos themselves who are already kind of in that ecosystem. But the question really comes up is like, why couldn't I set up my own private telco that even overlaps existing telcos? Like maybe we have redundant service. I mean, we have that already with telcos where, you've got AT&T versus Verizon versus T-Mobile, right?
So yeah,
So
and then
we
you have
already,
paradigms of off haul and back off.
exactly.
Like there's a whole bunch of other paradigms that exist in here of where they do want to play. They're incentivized oftentimes to play to actually clean up their network as well. Otherwise, it's going to cost them incredible amounts of money to go into the infrastructure. Like, so they're interested in having infrastructure in, tier 1, 2, and 3 cities. Beyond that, it becomes exponentially more like it doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting play there in terms of partnerships, and that's where I think I'm seeing much more of it happen. But keep going. I don't want to lose I feel like you were getting to a point there.
Yeah, well, I think that's the use case. That's an example of a use case I'm talking about where you could have parties who aren't part of the existing ecosystem of roaming for telco. How do they get involved without, if we take the intermediary out and we create a peer-to-peer network that does all the same things that the intermediary, the clearinghouse did, now we create a vector for entry for new participants.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so there's a lot of questions that go up there, right? One of them is like, how do I defend my moat, right? This is where all the telcos are thinking, how do I defend my business? But the other part of it is like potentially their users could be roaming on my network and I'm earning money too because we have this new relationship. So there's also potentially a bigger market. And so the challenge with that, when we were going through and figuring out that solution, was everybody had a different way to integrate. They had a different ERP, a different internal accounting system, and everybody had to spend a lot of money mapping their systems to the clearinghouse's API. And once they were mapped to the clearinghouse's API, the clearinghouse took care, acted as like that common language that allowed those transactions to be interpreted and sent back to the appropriate ERP. And so, and maybe it wasn't ERP, I think at the time, it's probably a billing and settlement and roaming platform specifically built to integrate. But the point being is like, it's very cumbersome to take an existing business system, and I'm using ERP to globally mean all of the systems that a company has, to take those systems or that ERP and map it to a common standard already. And
so why don't you replace it?
That's my question. That's what I'm getting to is like, we can go to the EVM side of the world and say, hey, we can replicate all that functionality that the clearinghouse does, but getting people to actually map their ERPs to that new system, that's the first friction point. The next friction point is when you have volatile utility tokens on the network or volatile network tokens, and I can't predict what my spend is going to be as a business. Because everybody right now,
unless you break apart and you still do the value in USD, but what you achieve or you receive is a variable asset token, right? So it fractionalizes go ahead.
Well, and think about how they do it now. Like everything is settled 90 to 120 days out.
Correct.
So I've
But
got
what's that doing?
accounts payable
What's
sitting
that
on
doing?
my books. What do you mean? What's that doing?
It's reducing turns. It's adding friction. It's lowering velocity of capital.
By having a net.
Oh, yes. Oh,
net
yes.
90 or net 120.
Oh, yes. So we proved this. So I'm proposing to you that if you replace
Go down that rabbit hole for me real quick.
Go there.
Yeah, we got 14 minutes.
So I'm proposing if you look at blockchain, and I don't even want to use that term, but just like distributed ledgers, databases, everything in a different way, which is we have an opportunity to upgrade the enterprise side too, which would be ERP, accounting, all of it. And not just because like, hey, we want to be disruptive and be an enterprise software player and go like, no, the value prop would be, can you affect key business drivers at a supply chain, value chain, or economy level? And if you can do that, then you start to change the notion. You get to fulfill the concept of cost center to profit center, which means that this thing that I'm operating on provides more value to my business than just I have to do it. I've got to have accounting. I've got to have ERP, and it does drive some efficiency, but really I don't have a net, like a massive, massive change to my business. Okay. So
let me restate that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to make sure, because you're talking in conduit lingo, and I want to make sure everybody else in the world here's what you're saying, at least what I think you're saying. So, Tashi's model is we're reducing the cost to game developers. They're already spending the money on this infrastructure. And what we're saying is, hey, spend less of that. You'll have to do a little bit of CapEx integration. But once you do that CapEx integration, your OpEx is going to be reduced by probably 50% if we're talking multiplayer gaming ecosystems, right? That's our value proposition. That's our front end value proposition, is we're going to save you money. What you're saying, Conduit's saying, is we're potentially going to do that too, because we're upgrading your systems, right? We're building some of these accounting principles and some of these things in as primitives in the system. So it actually aligns better than, say, like just a wide open EVM would. And we're doing this at a hardware level. So we're doing this so much more efficient, and we're using secure chips. So we're like pulling out a lot of the emulation of security that happens where there's also a vector of attack. And we're now using hardware to solve some of those problems. By the way, the hardware already exists and it's been out there for years. But you're basically saying, hey, listen, we might reduce the expense a little bit, but you guys are already performing these functions. Additionally, because you're using our hardware, we're also going to allow you to make money with that. So we're creating a new revenue stream as a business. So like where my value proposition with Tashi is save money and keep your players happy, like significant money and keep your players happy. There's still a little bit of a risk on the front end because you still have to integrate with Tashi. Your side is we might save a little bit of money because of efficiencies, but we're going to create an opportunity to generate more revenue. And when we talked about the original, I always joke that the 3 business drivers are make more money, spend less money, and stay out of jail. And mine is mostly around spending less money, and yours is a combination of spend less and make more, right?
That's it.
Is that fundamentally what we're saying here? Is how do we take?
Yeah, and actually, can I say that we fulfill the third one too? So I'm going to skip.
Absolutely.
I'm going to skip ahead. I want to skip just because you ended on that. I'm going to skip ahead and then I'll come back, which is it's estimated that somewhere between 5 and 6.5 of global GDP is lost annually to fraud. Well, that's trillions. Okay.
Wait, what?
Yes.
5 and 6.5 trillion
percent of global GDP.
Oh, percent
is lost to fraud.
And okay. What is global GDP?
Oh, I think it's sitting
like
at
60 something.
I think it's just over that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking, $2 trillion, $3 trillion lost
Correct.
to fraud.
Correct. So now remember, I told you that the growth of GDP is net new activity or turns. If you have something being pulled out of GDP, what does that do to these are major, major effects, right? Like huge quantifiable effects. Okay. So as we looked into that, fraud it's an interesting category. It's not all fraud like you would think. There's also like double accounting, right? Like errors and omissions, like things that aren't just pure fraud, but they get all lumped into this category of like, it's a loss. it's
right.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So what we proposed was that like, hey, we think we take this down to almost zero. And that was backed up by KPMG. And the reason is because we and I don't want to get into this side just here, but we've talked about those Petri net theory where two states of reality cannot exist in the same place at the same time, which is what forces the double accounting, right? Things must go, something must be given and taken off, like has to. And it's across everyone that participates. Okay,
real quick, let me just make sure. I've done a little bit of research on PetriNet since we talked our first time, like a couple months ago or a month ago, or what? Have we only known each other for like a month?
I don't know. It's been a whirlwind. I don't.
But PetriNet, the idea with PetriNet is that you have inputs and the outputs can never be more than the inputs.
That's it.
And it's mathematical, right? And so what you do is you have this almost like a state machine.
That's it.
Of inputs and outputs, right? So as you move from one state to the next state, you're taking inputs from multiple nodes or multiple edges, I think.
Anything, any input from anywhere could be IoT, right? Like think of supply chain, could be an individual, could be company, there's anything, any input. You're correct. And so two states can't operate in the same place. You also have a pure, robust. It's estimated the PetriNet theory at a certain position, which doesn't take long, gets to become quantum proof because again, you have to replay all of the states in the exact order in which they happen in order to make a change and disrupt, right? Like, well, that very quickly you can see this net gets way too complex, but you're able to replay reality, which means auditability is like not just like going and auditing it and finding the data structure and the data point. You can replay in a live scenario what happened through the net. That's like think about that, right? Like you can replay 6 months of commerce and rights and obligations changes. And so anyways, I don't want to go any further on. I want to go back to the supply chain thing. So our position was, we believe we can reduce fraud. KPMG was like, yep, we think you take it down to 0.01. Like that's worth trillions right there, just because like, this is incredible, right? Like you can't have this exist. Okay. So then we're like, one of the more sophisticated supply chains in the world is sandwiches. And I was waiting for your reaction. Yeah. It's a very tough, very sensitive supply chain. I want you to think about this. All of the food must be fresh to get it from the farmers to the deli. You have lettuce fall 10 degrees outside of variance, you have listeria.
Yep.
You have like
very sensitive to
very sensitive. And that's why I say sophisticated, because the IoT inputs, that all of the moving parts are, we're not putting things in boxes and getting them across the ocean, right?
Right.
Okay, so
and you can walk into any deli right now and grab a sandwich. So you know that supply chain's working.
That's it. And so we're like, if we wanted to prove complex ERP, supply chain accounting, all of that, like what's a really tough one? Well, it would be that, because you have a lot of IoT inputs too, right? And so there's a couple things that happen here. And I talked about, your nets, right? You said net 30, net 90, 60, 120, whatever it is. And I said, well, speed and velocity of capital. So one of the really big things in the sandwich industry is that they have a very high cost of working capital. Like up over 30%. Yeah,
well, and they have to, because if there is a net 60 or net 90 or net 120, you got to have operating capital for like 90 to 120 days in advance.
So if you can imagine, if you were just to be able to reduce that, what that would have a profound impact on an economy.
Yeah, you're talking about like, you don't have to hold on to as much from a cash flow perspective.
You're unleashing latent capital that can get deployed, create more turns, velocity, all like again. Okay.
Well, and latency is the right word too, because even when we talk about consensus, right, we talk about throughput and latency, right? Throughput is how much can you push through.
That's it.
And latency is how long does it take for this transaction to fully realize its value.
That's it. Right? And there's probably not two more important economic drivers in economies than that, which is interesting. Like we talk about from a technical standpoint, this is incredibly important. So if you could have technology affect that, now you've got something that could be very powerful on an economic level. Okay, so we ended up reducing that by over 50%. To put that in perspective, that was equivalent of billions going back into the economy.
Yeah. So, by the way, DePIN Crypto said that 5.25 trillion is 5% of global GDP.
There you go. It's big. It's very, very big, right? And so the other thing that we reduced was OpEx.
Yep.
There's massive, much more efficiency. So let me give you a scenario which came up. Lettuce fell out of variance. Okay. You had a system that was automatically tracking every IoT input, knew that had happened before the people even knew it had happened, right? And had already automatically reordered and had inventory coming. Before,
but that's a business process problem. Like, we've got automated business processes now, and I'm
100%.
sure like most of our supply chain is doing this already from a centralized
100%
on AWS.
As I said, there's not many things that are technically novel here. What's novel is when you start to pull it into a singular system that can move very efficient, that you're not doing the integrations, you don't have the mapping, you don't have the movement in and out of many of these systems, which causes the friction. And then you include things that aren't in their systems today, like settlement, like moving accounting all the way into here where, okay, I know right now that I could release or receive the cash because I don't have a double accounting issue. I don't have to go close the books. It's real-time accounting, right? Audited. Like, that doesn't exist today. Well, now we've just increased the velocity of capital. So you're right. When I'm pointing out these things, Ken, there's some of them that in isolation, of course, they're being done. You get the multiplier when you put the compound effect on it and bring it all together and have it across an entire supply chain. Now, go ahead.
And I think the challenge again comes back to, how do we map existing systems to what you're talking about? Like, how do I get my ERP to integrate with that? Or how do I integrate a new ERP that organically adopts that model? How do I deal with settlement in crypto, on and off ramps in crypto to cover this? Like, there's still some of these blockers there. Now, I think, we have trade finance. We have ways to overcome the crypto onboarding part of it, right? Somebody's going to play that role. I'm going to bet, Brandon, you guys are already thinking about how you guys are going to play that role in helping people on and off ramp fiat to crypto across multiple currencies. We've thought about it. When I was at Hedera, we thought about it quite a bit. But again, you got to have those primitives. You got to have those accounting primitives.
Yes, you do.
You got to have the identity and the authority primitives. You got to have the security primitives. I think I heard one of your guys say that security is not a problem of security. It's a problem of authority.
Did you like that?
Yeah, that was pretty funny. So, but the point, making sure that the right people are allowed to do the right things at the right time.
That's it.
And that's the outcome we're looking for, right? So security revolves around the outcome of making sure that people are authorized to do the things they're supposed to do.
I love that. Well, this is why I've loved all of our conversations, Ken, but you talked about primitives, which are so true, first principles, things like this, right? And I just keep going back to the analogy of, like, look, if your foundation's crooked, how do you expect your wall not to be crooked?
Yeah.
And your roof line to be crooked and everything else that you build upon it? And I'm going to tell you, this is not a knock to anybody. It's just a truth. We have fundamental first principles that are broken, that were built in fragmentation over the last 30 years.
Yep.
It's not a judgment to anyone. It's just, can we acknowledge the truth and go, like, wait, if we could start fixing those to become strong principles and integrated at the primitive level, what you can build on top of it is, first of all, you want to talk about getting to an MVP. Imagine if those products never had to deal with the primitives again.
Yep.
You just inherited, right? You would be getting to the amount of time people could focus on the user side would be exponentially more, because so much of the foundation is just like, take this and go. Now really focus on the experience.
Yeah.
Are we out of time?
Well, we are out of time. We are. I hate that Twitter does that to us. I think what I'm going to do is to switch it up next time we do this, so that we don't use the RTMP stream, and instead we just do a live stream.
Great.
The live stream will go start whenever we want to start and go as long as we want it to go. Because I think maybe there's value in us having the forcing function of getting off in an hour, because I think it forces us to focus a little bit. But sometimes I feel like I could just use another 10 minutes.
Yeah,
So,
I felt like I just woke up in the last 10 minutes.
I know that's the hard part, is like we finally got our bearings here, and
Yeah,
YouTube and LinkedIn are still going. So if anybody wants to watch this on YouTube, you're welcome to, but on Twitter, it's done. We already had 100 people watching it, by the way. This is
awesome,
just on Twitter. So this
awesome.
is more people than we get in our spaces normally, which I like. I think people like the video part of it.
Is
So
it the video?
I think so. I think people see the video and they go, "Oh, there's people
Fe-
there."
Feels more personal. I mean, it makes
Yeah.
sense, right?
I like spaces because I can bring people up and participate in the space
How
and
many
like get
people
new
can
perspectives.
you have on the video here?
That's a good question. There is a limit, but it's a big net limit. I think it's like 20 people or something like that.
Okay,
We
all
can
right.
we can bring people up. They just have to like sign in or click that link and then join, just like you did.
I got you.
So it
Gotcha,
is
gotcha.
it's a couple of steps, but it's not hard. I mean, maybe that's something we do, is like we invite certain people directly to come join us as they're in our chat. We're just like, hey, you join us, you join us. I've got moderators, so the moderators can participate too. But
I mean, I get why the video is way more. It's more interactive. It's more real,
yeah,
tangible. Like
and you see facial expressions, which for me, body language and facial expressions add so much to what you're saying. And it's just that second layer of communication on top of the visual, on top of just the audible. But
yeah, man, we're
Deepin
still
hopped onto
humans.
our Deepin hopped into our YouTube, so you see his comment there now.
I
You
got
can see
runs.
comments through YouTube and LinkedIn. And actually, when we do connect Twitter, you'll be able to see the Twitter comments as well. So I think that's the right answer. Is next week. Let's do that. Why don't we
Okay.
just do like the direct Twitter? We won't do the RTMP stream, and then that way, the hard part is like people can't, like there's nothing to save, and there's no link to share until we go live.
Really?
It just says you're live because it's just like a instant live stream.
On
So
Twitter.
you kind of on Twitter. So you
Yeah.
have to tell people like, "Hey guys, it's coming." And that's why I think a lot of people even on Twitter are pushing people to YouTube, because they're just like, "Hey, go, set a reminder in YouTube for a video stream that can go forever."
That
Well,
makes sense.
yeah. So it's a big gap in the Twitter ecosystem. I hope gets fixed soon. But if there was a way for me to be like, "Hey, we're gonna do a live stream at approximately noon," and set a reminder, and it's gonna go as long as we want it to go, that would solve everything for me. I just do StreamYard all the time.
Oh, your mic's out again.
Yeah, it does that.
There it is. There it is.
So, well,
Um,
cool.
all right.
I think the takeaway from this discussion was more around, and this is for all the YouTube watchers, but I think the takeaway for this discussion was more around, we'll say, authority. I think that's the discussion we're having right now. There's a lot of other things we're talking about too, as far as primitives.
Can I just say one thing there, Ken, too? Because I don't know that people I don't know that this has gotten through. And I apologize if it has, but I think so much of crypto Web3 has looked at identity and authority at the individual level, which is very important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not mitigating that at all. But I'm saying the actual real importance and the bigger breadth and the harder thing to solve, but the more valuable thing to solve is the same primitives that apply to commerce and an economy. And now you have different actors, right? You have to bring in companies, corporations, they have different layers. All if you can bring all of that in, now you're starting to get to primitives that make sense that the corporations or supply chains need to use in order to come over. You have the foundation layers, right? That they're like, look, we can't abandon this. This is fundamentally how we operate. And a whole point is that we should be wanting to bring that over because that's value. The more value we can bring over, we all benefit from this.
And I think DIDs are trying to do that. I think
they
that's
are
what they're trying to do with DIDs and VCs, right? But again, that's you could say it's a protocol play. It's a document protocol play. And I don't know if it's robust enough. It might be perfectly robust for what we're doing. I think a lot of the implementations struggle in the DLT space just because of inefficiencies on the DLT layer themselves. It's like they're not first-class citizens in the DLTs. It's something that gets implemented on top of it and kind of to the side of it, and you have to reference it with browsers and with third-party SDKs. It's just not a first-class citizen. There are certain protocols like Humanity Protocol that's trying to make it first-class citizen. So
let me ask you this real quick. Sorry, this is why we need more time.
yeah.
If you could choose in what you know right now, what parts of the primitives would you state with confidence should be a first-class citizen?
Well, I think exactly what we've been talking about. Like to me, the core primitives of a DLT would be first and foremost identity, which would include your credential attributes.
Yep.
And then secondarily would be rights and obligation.
Yep.
Some type of representation of rights and obligations and how we interact with those in the same way we just talked about. Being able to delegate, encumber, fractionalize, all of those things. So it's a big thought exercise. It's one that I've done on the NFT layer and have thought about it, but I haven't thought directly about what that looks like at a primitive layer. I know even with Hedera, we did keys and key lists and threshold keys. Like those are the three type. Well, and then now we've got smart contracts as a key. So when you have an account ID, the account ID is controlled by a key, a list of keys, and a list of keys means that anybody in the list can sign for this account. And then we have threshold keys, which is a list of keys with a threshold.
How do you guys do key management? So an attacked key, right? A fraudulent key, an attacked key. How do you deal with key management?
Yeah. So in a threshold key, which is what I would almost always use, in a threshold key, you'll say something like, there are 5 keys and we need 3 signatures to execute any action on this account.
Wait. Sorry, Ken. Sorry. Can I ask questions? So
sure.
of the 5, are the same authority and rights provisioned all the same? So you just need
rights and authorities are.
You need a majority of the 5, but all 5 have equal. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And so really the authority lies with any 3 of the 5.
Yep.
That's where all authority for this account lies with any 3 of the 5.
Yep.
Now tokens, we kind of broke it out separately. We said there's a wipe key, there's an admin key, there's a supply key. So we have different keys with different rights and authorities related to tokens, and those can also be threshold keys. So the token service took the primitive of the keys and their key management functions and applied them into a token use case, specifically for tokens, right? Based off of what fungible and non-fungible tokens look like in crypto today. That doesn't necessarily apply to every use case outside. I think we can emulate a lot of rights and obligations with tokens, but not every model would have been mapped onto the Hedera token model. So, but that being said, when it comes to keys, then you have your threshold keys. Now, the cool thing is you can set up multiple layers of threshold keys. I think we had you could set up 8 or 9 layers of threshold keys. So you could say it takes 2 of the 3 business units, and each business unit was its own threshold key. So each key in the threshold list was also a threshold key. So you could say it takes 2 of the 3 business units to execute a transaction over this amount. And say you had, the executive's office, the finance office, and the operations office, right? And each one of those had its own set of threshold keys. We're saying the executive office, it was just the CEO and maybe his executive secretary, and it was a 1 of 2 signature, right? So either one could sign on this transaction to represent the executive's office. And
were the keys held at an org level or at an identity level?
They're all at an identity level. So the actual
so if I was a board member over 6 companies,
yes,
I would hold 6 in this scenario. I would hold 6 different keys for the 6 different. If I was authorized,
you could hold 1 key that is part of a threshold list in every org if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would have 6 different keys.
Correct.
I think the closest that you would get to that would be like a hierarchical deterministic key, an HD key, where I have 6 independent keys that are based off of 1 root key. So that's probably the closest I would get to using the same key for every org.
I wouldn't use the same key, but I was just curious. I was trying to work through scenarios.
Yeah, you can. But keep in mind, like you've got your private key. That's all that matters. Private key, because the public key is derived from the private key real time. So all you got is your private key, and you have a private key, and you could do HD keys to generate multiple private keys. but your private key had an associated public key. That public key is included in a list, and that list has a number associated with it, and that number is the threshold. So you control your own private key, but the composite key that controls an account might be a composite of composites or an array of arrays.
Sure.
Arrays,
Sure.
right? You could figure out whatever logic. You could be like, I need the CEO or his executive assistant to sign, or I need the CFO plus one other accountant, or I need operations manager plus the COO to sign. And any two of those three orgs could sign to execute a function. So that's as close as we got to when it came to primitives on keys. Now, that being said, cool, we've got keys sorted, but we don't have authority sorted, right? There's a difference between the keys associated as an attribute of your identity and the authority that comes with those keys. Like, what specifically can this one key sign on a specific type of transaction in this threshold structure, but not another type of transaction? That logic didn't exist. If you wanted to incorporate that logic, you had to create a new account with a new business operation it integrated with, or a smart contract to control it, and now you're hard coding keys in. So yeah. So my point being is, like, the authority part, I can't have a key for a business, for a persona, have multiple authorities within the organization. Each key is its own. If you wanted to implement an authority scheme, you would have to have a different key for each delta of rights and obligations. Anytime there's a difference.
So then could you have, like, again, what you would need to do, or what you should be doing as well, is holding a rights and obligations or authority authorization, like it could be any of those four mixes, at a corporation level, in which an individual, an identity, corporation has an identity as well, right? Both identities. This identity comes in, new CFO comes in and is delegated the rights to use this key on the corporation's behalf. So the keys, the rights, are not the individual's rights. They're actually the corporate rights, in which this person has a granted authority to go do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and all we would do is we would swap out the key of the old CFO with the new CFO. So you can update.
You would change the key.
Yeah, so we can change the key structure, the key lists. And so what you do is you just go, okay, here's the new key list, and you have to meet the same threshold requirement to change the key list. So pulling the CFO out just would require the CEO's office and the operations office to sign a transaction. So,
yeah, I mean, and which is no different than, let's say, the same votes going to the board, corporate board, right?
Yep.
Like we're moving.
You could totally do it. You could say, we're going to restructure the company, and maybe you have a one of two key threshold, and one of those is the board, and one of those is the executive team. And then within the board, you've got its own sub key structure with a bunch of its own key lists of, like, and its own thresholds. Like you need, we'll say you need 5 of 7 votes or something like that, like some number like that in your board, or 3 of 5 votes, right? To make a change to the key structure over here. The problem is, with that model, theoretically, the executive team could rekey the board in a 1 of 2 scenario.
Yeah. So why don't you? I mean, you've gotten some behind the scenes with us, right? Like, why wouldn't you write that into a mandate for us?
You would. No, so the answer is there's a lot of logic that's not built into just strictly a key structure.
You can't solve it with just keys. That's the answer.
Like, that's the point. That's what I'm getting at here, right? Is that we've got key structures. We can get very complicated with key structures, but you can't solve the rights and obligations part.
That's it.
A key structure. You can do some high level stuff, and I think this is indicative of how we've built most of crypto technology.
Totally. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're on this. This right here. Like, I'm so glad this is it, Ken. Like, this is the high level is where we've been.
Right.
But there's no way we're going to move advanced value over if we don't start working down vertically. Like, if we can't drive the authorization down, we're going to have a problem. Well, no, the problem is we won't get adoption. They're going to go, I can't use this. I can't use this in our corporate sophisticated structure. So guess what, guys? I love what you're doing. I got to stay over here.
And that's the exact challenge we're having right now. That's exactly like every enterprise conversation I've had. It's been like, we have money allocated to figure out how to use blockchain. We have a team that we set up to integrate blockchain, but we can't use it. And it's almost every single enterprise project ends, even if they're subsidized, within 2 years. Just because these specific things is we're not finding places where we're saving money, adding money, or keeping people out of jail, like sufficiently valuable stuff, right? That's the first problem. Is it's hard to find that with the execution speed and the capabilities of the current state of blockchain. And the second part is just mapping onto their existing systems with the rights and obligations that are necessary. I mean, their existing systems, they've got strong ACLs all over the place. Now, granted, there's a handful of IT guys who could change all of that stuff if they became disgruntled. And that's what we're trying to fix. But the point being is, like, there's usually some kind of corporate governance in there where they're like watching each other as well.
So it's interesting, like, man, I love these conversations. That's why we kind of started with many of the things that we did, right? Like 5.5 years ago, going like, if we don't solve for these primitives, I don't know that we're going to realize what people think it's supposed to be. We didn't see how we'd get there. Right. And this is all that when you talk about primitives, Ken, they are not fun nor sexy.
No,
nobody wants to talk about them.
And they take a ton of time to validate. You have to do formal verification. I mean, I heard one of your guys talking about like one tiny component he's been working on for 2 years. And I'm like, correct. That's 2 years working on a component. So it's hard work that nobody wants to do, but it's the only way that you get enterprise adoption, which quite frankly, like 90% of the world's value is driven by enterprise.
100%
is driven by enterprise actions. Like, we need enterprises even as individuals for everything from supply chain, logistics, settlement, online, whatever. And we can carve out pieces for ourselves, which I love. That's it. When we take all of these primitives that are working at the enterprise level, that are getting adoption in the enterprise level, and then we carve out a piece of it for ourselves. Now we've got true interoperability between what I've carved out for myself, which is the promise of Web3, and what everybody else in the world is interacting with, right? When I can carve out my own little private loyalty program for me and my family members to figure out how we're going to pay for everybody to attend family reunion. Right. I've built my own little economy with my 200 people in my family reunion group. Right. But we need to be able to settle back to PayPal or back to our bank accounts or pull money from PayPal in our bank accounts. Or we need to be able to go pay the venue. We got to pay for food.
Yes. Yeah. Or when we talk about the mutualization of value, bring it all the way back to the first one that we did, right? Is that like, if you think of that way, well, then guess what? You should want a corporation sitting to your right-hand side driving value on the same thing that you're operating on, right? And you should want one over, like, we want as much over here. I don't care what form factor, shape, or anything it looks like. We just want it over. And then I think you go, go ahead.
The point you're making, because when you get into that mutualization, so I want to just make this, if everybody's not getting this, let me make sure that this
is anyone still listening to us, or is it just
you? We've got two people on YouTube. We got Jason and we got DePIN Crypto, and they just posted in Discord. So Jason's saying, please don't stop. This is like the exclusive, right? This is where the action happens. It's after the hour mark.
It's true.
Everything comes together. But I think the point that you're making, and I think this is the valid point that I want to get to, is when you talk about mutualized value. It's a cool word. I really like the word. In my mind, it captures what you're trying to say. I don't know that a lot of people understand what mutualized value means. The example you gave was it Rolls-Royce that did the supply chain alignment?
Yeah.
So
they did.
Rolls-Royce, which did the supply chain alignment, where throughout the supply chain, they created value for everybody on the sale of the car. So once the car is sold, everybody got the upside of that. So however they did that, I think rev share is usually a common way to do it. There's always some type of arrangement like that that helps align the entire supply chain. What you're saying is imagine that type of alignment happening in an entire economy. Because right
That's
now,
it.
when I go buy a burrito at Adalberto's down the street from my house, like we have no alignment other than I want their product and they want my money, right? That's it. There's no alignment outside of that. And there's no alignment with their suppliers. Their supplier gets no benefit of me buying a burrito. As a matter of fact, if they can go find another supplier that does it cheaper and gives them a worse product, like they're probably going to go with the worst product with a different supplier, right? There's no alignment. It's not about loyalty. We've lots of times I think in the business space, especially when you're talking customer vendor relationships, people talk about loyalty, especially in supply chain where you have these really long lasting relationships. Supply contract expires and the buyer decides, yeah, I'm going to switch. I'm going to shop out my supplier or my vendor this year.
Yep.
And so it's not about loyalty though. It's about alignment of value. And I think if you can figure out how to do that, and I say primitive because what I mean at primitive is like it's a fundamental feature. It's like the standard library of a programming language.
Yes.
When I go into a standard library, most libraries have a square root function.
Yep.
I don't have to figure out how to mathematically solve for square root in math anymore. I just go, oh, there's square root. Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
That's what I mean by primitives is like if we've got a mechanism where we can align our interests that is part of the primitives of the network, meaning that there are accounting primitives, there are identity primitives, there are value mutualization primitives.
Yep.
Logic.
Settlement security, like all these
And
should have
it's
primitive elements.
it's more than just the Lego blocks, right? We can all build the Lego blocks. It's the pre-built Lego structures that say, oh, you want to build a castle? Here's the start of a castle. Make the towers as high as you want. Put two of them together. I don't care. But here's a castle. Oh, you want to pull that tower down and want to put up a bike shed instead? Go for it. But the idea is like, and I think this is what you guys are calling like mandate templates, right?
Yep.
We've got these primitives, these patterns that we can put out there that people can adopt quickly, that add immediate value, and then they can tweak to their needs. And those are the primitives I'm talking about, right? What is the square root function of global finance and global
Yes,
value exchange, if you will. I don't want to say finance because finance is a loaded term, but
it is.
global value exchange, right? And I think that's where you're going when you say mutualized value. What you're saying is the mutualized part is that everybody participates in the value growth of the whole ecosystem. That doesn't happen today. Right now, everybody
It's
has
not.
their silo in the ecosystem or in the economy. Let's say economy, more than ecosystem. In the economy, we've each got our own silo and we're focused on our revenues and our expenses. But where you can create a mutual value, meaning that I can now get a benefit in my company by aligning my interests with somebody else in that same economy. Now we've got more turns, we've got more loyalty, we've got more efficiencies. Lots of things happen as a result of doing that. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. Like when you say mutualized value.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's two things I want to go back to primitives. And I just want to make this statement. Like when you create standards on primitives, the other thing that you start solving for very quickly as a high level statement is things like interoperability. Because you separate the opinionated piece from an integration primitive piece. And now interoperability is like comes with everything. It's like, no, we're all operating off of the same primitives, which means we can connect and move things very quickly. And then we get to all have our massive amount of opinion on top. Cool. That's amazing. Right. The other thing that I would say is that there's three things that happen in the economy fundamentally for mutualized value. You could be reducing costs. We've talked about that. You could be increasing revenue, or the concept of like, and this is one that's usually like probably the most missed. And I think I've used the example of private equity groups before, right? So they'll roll up like 30 companies that are doing the same thing. None of those companies could increase any revenue or lower any cost. And the multiple on all 30 of those companies, because the revenue stream is pooled and is now a discount on a future cash flow of a larger, more diversified revenue stream, you've just increased sometimes 2 to 4x the enterprise value. And you did nothing, Ken. You mutualized, right? And we can do the same thing economically, is my point. You could have this economy looking like a massive private equity group with no topco, because we're all our own individual participants. But what we can start doing is financial engineering that can only be done in corporations today at an individual level. Okay, that's really interesting.
Yep.
Right? We can start selling future streams of cash flow as a whole, increasing the value of everyone's business. So if you have any combination of those three happen, you have a strong mutualization of value. And that's what we're trying to get to. Now, why you have to have all of this. You can't do that without primitives. You can't do it without solving, getting everyone on similar infrastructure. There's all these chicken and the eggs in order for fulfillment to happen. But that's also why we've been working on this for so long and haven't come to market.
Well, and I think that's always going to be the biggest challenge, right? Is how do you get adoption? And that's been the challenge for everybody who's building the product. Now, the bigger challenge has been, if you don't have the right Lego blocks, no one's going to adopt your Lego set, right? If I don't have a 2x4 piece, it gets really hard to build a lot of structures that I would want to build in my Lego structure.
Very true.
Right? If I don't have the flat platform.
Oh, your mic's out.
To build. Uh-oh. Again?
There it is.
Woo. What the heck? I'm going to have to figure this. Okay. This is a nice mic too.
It's like a wire. That's what it feels like.
It's got to be.
Like something's loose. Because as soon as you hit it, it comes right back.
Boom. All right. I'm gonna have to do some tear down and rebuild and stuff like that. That's what I was using the office last week. It's just a little Yeti USB microphone, and it just works. And this is like a fancy SM7B Shure microphone. Like it's like legit broadcast mic and everything. And but then everything's temperamental because it's all like high speed stuff. So, but yeah, so we're in the Jason saying you got 4 in here now, so you can't stop. Woo-hoo. Like people are coming over from the other. They're like, oh, it's still going. This is the after show right here. This is the exclusive after show. If you know, you know. So, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I think all of this. So by the way, I've had this conversation like 100 times in the crypto space over the last.
Have you really?
Years. The same conversation, and everybody thinks they have the answer. So that's always my concern. So like yesterday, I told you I'm cautiously optimistic about everything that Conduit's working on. I love what Conduit's working on. I will shill you guys because you're the closest to what I've seen as being potentially successful. But I'm also going to be very cautious about it because
for sure
execution is one thing, adoption is another thing. And for me, adoption is a lot about how do we map onto existing systems. And that's the challenge, because right now there's nothing that maps onto existing systems. We spent a lot of money building trading platforms and DEXs and NFT projects, celebrity and sport NFT projects. We haven't spent a lot of money figuring out how to map onto enterprise systems or into existing systems in general, right? So when you go and get a grant from any one of these L1s or L2s, the grant almost always goes to how many wallets can you create and how many transactions can you create for us in the short term. Almost always. Sometimes they'll throw TVL in there as well. And that's the challenge. I've not seen, there have been a few that are close, like ServiceNow, I'm sure got a grant from Hedera to build out their ServiceNow infrastructure, which simplified their ESG, their renewable energy credit tracking system called the Guardian. And they created a very simplified drag and drop, very enterprisey feeling thing. And people are using it. It doesn't create a lot of wallets and doesn't create a lot of transactions, but it is an enterprise use case. There have been other enterprise use cases I've seen on Hedera that have picked up. But the largest enterprise use case that was Atma.io was fully subsidized by Hedera for about a year now. And I don't know if their account ran dry or the subsidy ended, but we went from easily 2,000 transactions a second down to 1 transaction a second, 1 to 2 transactions a second on Hedera. So even though people are using the tech, the long-term value of the product is always the question mark for me. Like, how were we? It's just like cognitive dissonance, right? Or buyer's remorse. You know, somebody goes in, as long as they're getting it for free, they're going to use it. As soon as they have to pay for it, now the cognitive dissonance kicks in of like, should I bought this? Is the value actually there? Did I make a mistake? And sometimes people, they fool themselves into thinking that they made a good decision, but they still feel like icky inside that they made a bad decision. Happens to me every time I buy a car, which is crazy because you need a car, right? So
isn't that crazy?
It's like you need it anyway. It's like you're going to spend the money anyway. Just get over it. But every time I buy a car, I'm just like, did I really need that car? Did I need that level of car? Did I really need those features? And then you kind of like over time emotionally justify it. I'm like, you know what? I'm actually very comfortable riding around in this car. And like, oh, you know what? I do actually like the Bluetooth feature for my phone and Apple Play and stuff. So over time, you convince
yourself. Would that dissonance help if the car made you money?
See, that's the difference. Yeah. See, that's the point I'm making is.
Sorry, I jumped ahead, Ken. I'm sorry.
No, that was the perfect transition. That was the perfect segue of, you know, when we're going to these enterprises, if we can go to them and we say, listen, it's going to cost you $1 million to transition over to our system because we know there's going to be a mapping effort.
Absolutely.
You guys are built in SAP. We have a team that specializes in SAP and transitioning. So we'll have an SI that comes in, helps make the transition. It's $1 million to do it, but you're going to save $50 million a year because of this transition. And here's why. On top of that, we're going to generate money for you too. And I don't know what those numbers are going to look like, but you're going to generate money. But if you can come in and say, this is going to cost you $1 million to transition, this is going to make you $50 million, it's going to save you $50 million a year, and it's going to make you money on top of that. Now we've got a pitch, right? Now we've got something that people can take to their boards and go, yes, sign off on that. Not only sign off on that, but when we see those numbers actually come in and outperform our estimates, now they're going to go, oh, wow, that was a great decision. And we don't have the cognitive dissonance. We've got the justification of the decision.
That's it.
It's all math. It's very simple, right? And so I think that's the point we need to get to with these technologies. Like I can build a simple, small little app that solves a very specific problem in the enterprise space. And I can make that argument very clearly. What you're talking about is a very fundamental change to their systems. And the question is how do you reduce that risk as much as possible during that adoption period? And how do we paint the appropriate picture and then meet those expectations of the painted picture? Like, I don't know if we can make any estimates about how much they're going to earn as a profit center, but we can absolutely figure out what the cost, the CapEx is going to be to adopt the technology and the adjustment or the decrease in their OpEx. Like we can do those estimates pretty quickly and figure out how we're going to meet that. So, but my point being is like, that's the blocker right now. Like I cannot go to any current Web3 project and with confidence, go to an enterprise and say, this is going to cost you $1 million to implement and you're going to save 50 million a year or anything of that sort, right? I can't say that with any project. And I'm just wondering, first of all, why have we not invested in those? I can do it with my own project. With my own project, I can go to a game development company and go, what phase are you in your game development? Have you already solved the netcode problem? Have you already solved the multiplayer part of it? If you haven't solved it, this is what it would cost to implement Tashi. And this is how much it's going to save you on your server costs.
Because everything that you just said, Ken, didn't include one important sentence, which is when Moon.
When Lambo.
Like, so that's why. I mean, I make a joke about it, but I'm actually being very, very serious. There are things that have occurred in crypto in terms of velocity that I actually believe have incentivized bad and lazy behavior.
Yep.
I'm sorry, but I just got to call it like it is. Like you're not actually walking through these conversations that you're talking about that are vitally important and rooted in reality because, well, I didn't have to. I could launch a token, do a TGE and like, why do I have to go solve all that, Ken?
And I will tell you the top 20 L1s are having these, they want this type of discussion.
Would you say they're starting? Because I haven't heard it. If we go back to like when they really launched and stuff, I didn't hear these types of, it feels like there is something starting to happen with the more mature conversations going like, hang on.
It's been happening for 6-7 years.
It has. Okay.
Conversations, but you have to be talking to the right people. You have to be talking to the biz dev, the developer advocates,
and you're telling me for 6 or 7 years, they still don't have answers to the questions you're posing?
No.
How's that possible?
There are some theses. Like if I look at a lot of the Hedera engagements with the enterprises we talk to,
yep,
there's a lot of hypotheses about what could be valuable to them. But in the last 6 years, if there was actual value there, I suspect that the corporations, the enterprises, would have spent the money to do the CapEx adoption, for the adoption, and you would have higher transactions than just one company pushing all activity that is subsidized by the network. And some of that is a leadership problem. Some of that is just a messaging and positioning problem. Some of it is a BD problem. Like
Sure.
I had that problem every time I went in and had that discussion. It was sometimes hard for me to see where they could use the technology. And sometimes that's the hard part when you have something that's so broad. If you've got a programmable interface, it's just like, here's the language of Rust. Think of all the value this language could bring you. And it's like, well, wait a second. Like, okay, how do I use it though? Like, what do I have to compose to make this meaningful to my business? And so people build software on top of a programming language. That's where we are with the L1s. Is the L1s are like, and this is exactly why we went after gaming, right? We were like, here's a clear use case with, a multi-billion-dollar TAM. Like we can look at this and we know what our serviceable obtainable market is out of this. Even if we took 1% of that entire market, we're already a multi-$100 million company.
Yep.
1% of our obtainable market, right? And that's not thinking about the available market, the TAM side of it. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that has a problem that we can go in. We know what the CapEx is for adoption. We know what the OpEx effect is. We can paint that picture for them. And everybody has said, we love what you're doing. Go get 100 games using it. And then we're on board.
Are you guys taking care of the CapEx?
We can't right now because we're using everything we have to mature the technology.
Understand that. Sorry, let me just go to a future state.
Do we want to? Yes.
Yeah.
Do we want to help with the CapEx for maybe the first 100 games? Or
so I just thought I was just thinking of something, and I just want to. Can we whiteboard for a second here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Like, are you familiar with equipment leaseback plans or buyback?
Mm-hmm.
Could you not do that on the cost saving side? And said, literally, we're going to CapEx everything. We're going to install this, and we're going to share in the cost savings in which we show. So, like, we only win or get anything if we do exactly what we're saying, because they're looking at this through a risk, right? Can you actually do? Okay, is there a way to mitigate the risk through the agreements and the arrangement?
So with gaming, the risk is also the future revenue. So if they start losing players because of a bad experience, there's a bigger risk there than just the CapEx.
Yep.
And so that's the bigger challenge that we have with the big, AAA game studios right now is they want to see 100 games using our technology, which by the way, we've already got almost 40 games signed up to integrate with us. Yeah. So, and we've been at it for 2 months, right? Onboarding games. So this isn't something that I think is going to be hard for us to do. My expectation is within 18 months, we'll have the 100 games out in the market, making money, fully de-risking the technology. And then we can go back to the AAAs and say, all right, look, it's de-risked. And at that point, I think what you're talking about makes sense. And we've thought about similar models of like, how do we de-risk this for them, both from a CapEx perspective, but initially it's a technical de-risking that we have to do.
I mean, I know many, many models in which that was incredibly valuable because most people on the forefront didn't think you could actually achieve the metrics that you were doing. And so they were betting that you would underperform that and they would win, right? And if you overperform that, you absolutely win in the cost savings.
Well, and that's exactly how Launchbadge, my engineering company, started. That's how we started our company, is with an HR software company that They were doing, I think it was something like 20 customers, 20 clients, and one of them was like was Disney, and another one was Fossil Watch, and like Vizio, and like so they had some pretty big clients, and they're doing HR packages and management for them. But every time they brought on a new client, they like copied the code base and moved it over and ran it as its own instance, and they had to have a developer managing each of those code bases. And we came in and said, why don't we convert you guys to software as a service? Like we'll build it so it's all configurable and everything. And they're like, fine. And that was our first, it was like $30,000 a month for a year, right? It was nothing from a company perspective, but it was one of those things where we had like 2 engineers working on it for a year. And our agreement was that we would get 2% of the additional revenue they got because of our technology. So when they had additional revenue, so they were stuck at something like 8 million a year or something like that. And they went to like, I think it was like 18 million or 20 million a year after implementing our stuff, because now one developer could manage like 100 clients instead of one developer handling like 3. And so it even got to the point where they didn't even need to have developers on staff. They could have actually account managers do most of the work, and they just had fewer developers on staff. And so, but that's exactly right. Is what we did is we aligned their success with our success, and so we had aligned interests. And so I'm a huge believer in that model. And so what you're talking about is very similar. Of when we go to the game companies and we say, hey, listen, we'll do the development for you, or we'll cover that cost in some way, but we want a piece of the upside. Like whatever the savings is, we want a piece of that comes directly to us. Until we get paid back, and then some.
Yep.
That's always the trick, is
paid
back and then some.
Yep.
But you're absolutely right.
So where do you see Tashi in 18, 36 months? Both of those.
Yeah, so 18 months I see us launching our first major AAA game. Now there might be somebody who comes in early because they're excited about the technology, or we get in early enough on their development process. But I suspect that's when you're going to
say there might be, as in someone's sniffing around.
We've got multiple someone's sniffing around.
But hey, if any of those people are listening, it's time. Let's go. I would say something which my grandpa always used to say, which is it's time to either shit or get off the pot.
Yeah,
French, but let's go.
Well, and we've got one in particular that says they're planning their design in the design phase of a new game. Mm-hmm. This is a AAA company. They're in the design phase of a new game, and when they get to the netcode part of it, they want to bring us in. And so it's so the netcode design part of it's after the graphic design part and the game design part. So that discussion is going to happen much sooner than 18 months. But keep in mind, like game development is a good AAA game is at least 6 years, sometimes 10 years in the making. So my suspicion, though, is within the next 18 months, we'll have our first major AAA game announcing using Tashi at the core, doing a press release with us, and over 100 games actually using our technology. And probably significantly more, because once everybody realizes what we're doing, I think every indie game in the world is going to want to use our tech.
Yep.
I think they're going to go, oh, multiplayer? Oh, even we have a single player, but now I can add multiplayer functionality to my single player. Done so.
Yeah.
So I think that's the 18-month mark. The 36-month mark, I don't think gaming is the limit for us. You and I have had this discussion before, but the technology that we're building is fundamentally synchronizing data sets. And so the opportunity there lies in everything from multi-master replication of databases, message queues, configuration managers, like all of that stuff is there. And gaming for us is really the forcing function. It's really because gaming requires low latency and high throughput. We're using it to force us to build the technology with those things in mind. So, but that all being said, last year in November, we tested the throughput, because we can tune for latency or we can tune for throughput, right? And if we tune for latency, we can get as low as 30 milliseconds, 28 milliseconds of finality.
There's got to be an equilibrium between the two as well, correct? So there's an optimization for either one. Is there an equilibrium between the two?
Yeah, you can tune it in either direction. right?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say there's an equilibrium. I would say whatever your use case is what we tune for.
Okay.
Right.
Fair.
So if you're allowed to have up to a second of latency, but you need to have 5 million TPS,
Yep.
guess what we're tuning for?
Yep.
So last November, we already hit the million TPS, 1.2 million TPS at sub 900 milliseconds latency. So we were like 890, 897. And so that was us just doing a quick test to see what would happen if we tuned for throughput. Everything in gaming is tuned for latency though. So while we're still, sitting at around 30 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds of latency, we're getting, 14,000 to 20,000 TPS easily, which, by the way, is way more than you need for a video game.
Oh yeah.
Like that's like a 100-player video game right there that you would need for that type of throughput. So, and I'd also argue there's another factor there is like number of players is what we're tuning for too, right? So we want to have low latency with 16 players is kind of our sweet spot. So number of players, latency, and throughput are kind of the three variables that we tune for. And depending on the use case, we can tweak things to make them scale for different use cases. But that all being said, like again, gaming is the forcing function. It's what's forcing the low latency part of it. But there are some people who are going to say, I want 10,000 people in my network, and we're going to have to tune for participants. There are some people who are going to say, I want 5 million TPS, and we're going to have to tune for throughput. Yeah, exactly. So, and we can tune for all of those. We've already tuned for throughput. We've already tuned for latency. Number of players, we've done all of our tests between 8 and 100 players. So that's kind of where we kind of feel comfortable with the numbers. 16 is kind of our sweet spot where we don't see a lot of degradation in latency. And so 16-player games is awesome for most people. 32 is fine. We were very competitive at 32, still sub 100 milliseconds of latency. Even I think at 64, we were still sub 100 millisecond. But once you get up to about 100, we were getting a little bit more latency. Over 100, I think it was like 150 or 200 milliseconds of latency at about 100 players, which, depending on the game you're playing, that's fine. If you're playing an MMO, in most cases, that's fine. We're all playing with that kind of ping anyway. So anyway, the point being is that we can tune for all kinds of things. And in 36 months, I see us solving a lot more problems outside of the gaming space, but we're using the gaming space to really drive that innovation.
So do you have, you talk about database. Database can literally be any super broad, right?
Sure.
Your toe into the market, or at least that's how I'm positioning it, is gaming, and I love it. I love what you guys are doing there. It also makes complete sense. If you were to take the database side, is there a particular vertical that you would say like, hey, we actually think that this is primed for, distributed database concepts, or that they're already talking about? Do you know that, or is that still maybe too far out that level of granularity isn't on Tashi's radar?
Yeah. Well,
I'm just curious. That's all.
Yeah. I think the verticals aren't as clear in the shared database, shared authority database is what a lot of people call it, model. You've got things like Cloud Spanner that are trying to solve that problem across organizations. We've got CockroachDB, which is probably our most direct competitor in the shared database space. Cockroach doesn't operate anywhere at the same performance metrics that we do with the same trust model. But they're doing fundamentally they're solving the problem that we would solve for the time being. So, but there's lots of scenarios where shared databases, like sometimes it's just an availability problem, right? Sometimes you're like, I just want there to be a read database near me and a write database that will eventually be consistent against all the read databases.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's just like the CDN problem, the distribution problem, or the high availability problem of I want to get access to the data. Sometimes there's a redundancy, like instead of doing RAID architecture on the hardware level, on the drive level, it's like, well, what if we did RAID plus double or triple replication across regions, right? So there are different use cases where it makes sense. I think a lot of enterprises, even between departments, are going to want to have some type of master replication.
Dude, the replication thing's massive.
Yeah.
Again, because they're getting crushed on cost for replication inside of the current databases.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and replication on Oracle is hard.
Yeah,
It's very expensive to maintain replication on Oracle, because not only are you paying for the Oracle license, but now you got to pay for the replication plugin that makes that happen. Postgres tries to do it, but they struggle with it as well. But even like looking at configuration management. Now, configuration management is where I think the biggest part is, like etcd, which is like what they call Hive cluster configuration management.
Yep.
That uses Raft right now, which is a consensus protocol. But Raft doesn't have the same trust properties and doesn't have the same performance metrics of Tashi. So already we could go into etcd, rip Raft out, drop Tashi in, and now anybody who's using etcd for anything gets a performance gain and an improvement in the trust model. Like, that's an easy one. Like, people could just like yoink, drop, and it's in. So the challenge is it's much harder to, because again, when we're at the lower primitives like that, when we're at the lower level, I shouldn't say the primitives, but we're at the lower level of the composable stack of technology, the use cases are massive. As you move up into the verticals, that's where use cases become more clear, when you move up into specific verticals. So for us to go after databases or message queues or configuration managers, we're basically saying everybody everywhere can use our technology. But now the question is, what's the go-to-market on that?
Yep.
Go-to-market could be, we're going after, DoD contracts. It could be, we're going after universities. We're going after supply chain data synchronization or configuration management, or IoT for configuration management and message queues. Like, there are different, and even if you say IoT, it's like, cool. IoT is a category. It's still not a vertical.
Yep.
I know people still talk about IoT like it's a vertical, but it's not. Like, IoT, I mean, just look at what's happening with DePIN right now. With all of these sensor projects, there's so much room for multiple kinds of sensors. I could have my roof covered in GPS, like weather sensors, like telco relay stations. Like, there's plenty of things I can have my whole roof covered in from the DePIN side of it. Like, IoT is a lot more. It's much bigger than just a category. And so even then, the vertical approach, we had mobility.
Speaking of that, you want to think of something really crazy?
What's that?
One of the most sophisticated DePINs in your house. Do you have a guess what it is? I'm gonna expect you to
sophisticated. Okay, the most sophisticated DePIN in my house.
It's not a DePIN today, but it should and could be.
Oh, geez. Okay, that makes it a little bit harder for me.
It does.
I was going to say the internet, especially like Comcast, where they actually use their modems to broadcast out.
It's your modern fridges.
Why would that be a DePIN?
There's a lot of sophisticated in those, like compute, IoT sensors, everything that reside in those modern fridges.
Okay.
And everybody has them. How often is it actually being used at its full capacity?
Are you talking about like external barometric pressure, humidity?
Literally leaving this so wide open, all of it in terms, and also the compute that resides in there. Those are full computers running the modern smart fridges.
Well, I mean, they're Raspberry Pis, but you can do a lot of stuff.
You can do a whole lot with that. That's sitting there most of the time, not actually in use.
Yeah. Well, and that's going to be all of your washing machine, your dryer now with Samsung have the smart stuff.
Correct.
Now they're not running Raspberry Pi.
I'm sitting here just like, when you start looking at the world and like the big claim for the market, I understand why. So I'm not totally disagreeing, but it's like, we don't have enough, compute, GPU and everything else. I'm like, actually, I don't know that I agree. I think we have a latency issue, as in latent. Right? We have a massive amount of IoT, of compute, of just things that are just sit and are not used until they need to for that one particular time, and the rest of the time they're sitting. Like,
see, and then the problem becomes an electricity problem, though. Like, if we optimize the compute problem, now we have an electricity problem, and then we just need to have micronuclear everywhere, and then we're golden.
Yep. Or some other interesting nanotechnology that's coming out too. But yes, I mean, like, my point is that everything resides in give and take and in balance, right? And like bringing things into balance. So to that point, Ken, you're right. At some point now we cause a different issue, right? But how about we get to that? How about we get to the point in which we have we've maximized what we already have out there in an effective way, and now we need to shift and solve, or we have some understanding of where that equilibrium is so that we're solving. Maybe we don't get all the way to it, right? But my point is, like, we're not there today. We could go Uberize much of what's existing out there today, as in or Airbnb, whatever model you want to use.
Yeah.
And we haven't ran into the secondary issue just yet.
Well, and so I'm going to bring it back to conduit, because now how do we do that in a way where I protect my house from prying eyes?
Yeah, I think
to make that compute available to anybody outside of my home network, I have to have some type of gateway that protects my network from unauthorized access to those devices.
You absolutely,
and also segmentation of operations on those devices too. Like, because what I don't need is I don't need somebody going in and saying, I just need you to run this calculation on your fridge and then have it like change the temperature on my fridge so it spoils everything or freezes everything. Like,
correct. So let me pose some different paradigms, because there's a lot of different ways in which both attack vectors and solutions. Perhaps the use of the fridge is only for internal. Okay. But then does that free up a different device that has a different risk profile to be able to be given to the network? So you're not exposing your fridge to the outside, but you are optimizing it for internal use for your consumption. See what I'm saying? Which all you're doing is shifting resources at this. That's all you're maximizing is shifting resources all into different risk profiles and just saying, like, we have unused resource. And to your point, that may be something that you don't want to release to the outside. I wouldn't, but I may want to use the resourcing for it. So do I have an orchestration coordination layer that can do that?
Well, okay. So now you're going to a different angle, which is what I'd like to go to, which is like, give me my plug and play home automation, my home assistant, right? Like, I'd love to be able to look at my home cameras whenever I want. I'd love to be able to like see what the moisture level is in my garden. I'd love to like know what the temperature is in my house when I'm away before I come home. Like, all those things that you can kind of do if you buy into the Apple or the Google ecosystem for home automation stuff.
Yep.
But now you're handing all of your information over to Apple and Google. Apple, I'm a little bit less concerned about because they've been so strict on privacy, but I still don't like the idea of somebody else having control of that.
Agreed.
Plus, I definitely don't want anybody else seeing my cameras. Like, that's a security concern for me. Like, I don't need anybody else knowing what's going on with my cameras. And so they're all external cameras. So don't get any crazy ideas over there. All my cameras are outside my house. So, but the point being is, I don't need anybody knowing what's happening on my block, right? I don't need.
You didn't hear me saying hi through your camera last week?
Yeah, seriously. But that's what I want, is I want that plug and play. So when you talk about like activating resources in your home, if I'm just like, well, now I can do a bunch of things at my home that I wasn't able to do, like media management, Sonos style audio synchronization around the house without having to pay the exorbitant price of Sonos. Like, how do I do all of those things and then leverage my fridge and my TV and whatever, my smart toaster, to coordinate those things and facilitate that functionality, all while protecting my house from the outside?
Yep.
And then if I have a resource that was previously used to do some of those jobs that could be made available outside, great. And it can make me money, even better. But fundamentally, what I'm thinking of is, how do you give me convenience? How do you give me more value without the risk? Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. Like, I just don't want to have 1,000 vendors I'm paying subscription fees to. Even my garage door opener has a camera on it that I can look at real time. But if I ever want to watch the camera, if I ever want to store the video from the camera, I have to pay them a subscription. No question about it. I just have to. That's just how they built it. And I'm just like, man, I would love to like
store locally. Like, you can't
store local. Like, I've got hard drives everywhere to store local. I can store everything local. I'm using it for my 6 cameras around my house right now. I've got an array of hard drives. I'm building a
And
freaking
that's such a bad move because that's literally easier to do than the cloud concept, which means the only reason they're doing that is a power play on monetization. And I lose so much respect
well,
when I
they're
see
like,
that
you can
stuff.
watch the video live. So if I ever want to watch the video live, I can do that. But I don't get notifications and I can't watch any historical video without paying them. And I was like, well, that sucks. I want to know when the cat pooped in the corner in my garage. Like I want to know those things. Which cat was it? Which cat am I going to blame for this? Right? Or where did my one tool go? Where did my
Yep.
like who picked up the tool? And so anyway, but that's what I'm talking about is like the vision you're selling sounds good. And I like the premise of the vision, but my real question still comes down to adoption and the CapEx.
Sure.
It always is going to come back to that of like, how does this work with my existing systems? Is the first question. And what is it going to take to make it work with my systems? And what CapEx am I going to have? And then fundamentally, what benefits am I getting for that? And if the answer is you don't have to pay the subscription fee to these guys, you don't have to give Google your video anymore. You don't have to do like all these different values you can add up, and I can quantify that against the CapEx and go, the investment is worth the juice is worth the squeeze, right?
Yep.
If I can look at that and go, okay, I'm confident that the value is greater than my cost, like then we're having a discussion. But until we can like start to quantify that stuff, it's still all like nice to have. And I'm excited to look at the technical components of it and do the planning.
Yep.
But until I can quantify that value, I don't feel confident about the business side of it.
Sure.
So
yeah.
But I know that's where we're going. And by the way, we're now hitting our 2-hour mark.
All right. Well,
yeah, we should probably cut it right now because I do have other things that I got to get done today.
word.
But I want to thank you first and foremost, Brandon, for joining because these are always good conversations. I think we could probably go for another couple hours if we wanted to.
We could. Same time next week. Are we gonna
do it next week? Do we want to do stream or do we want to do space? Because we can talk about it and maybe we can put it out to a poll on X because I think
let's
there
do
are
that.
people that actually want to join us.
Let's do that. Let's see what you got to give the people what they want. So let's see what they say. And then maybe even, what would also be interesting is do another poll of topics. See what people want to hear. Because there's a lot of different areas that we could go and even go deeper in some of these things. But it's like, what are people interested in? I'm also curious generally, like what are other, I know what I'm thinking about. I know what you're thinking about. Right. But what are other people wrestling around with? And what can we use for topics? So, yeah.
Yeah. And is any of this, like, I would love to just give them homework. So as a matter of fact, I'm going to talk to everybody who's listening to the end of this video. If you've made it the full 2 hours and almost 3 minutes, if you've made it this far, the homework is to listen to last week's video, listen to this week's video. And is there anything in those topics you'd like us to dig deeper in? Or is there anything that we've missed that you'd like us to touch on? So that's the homework for everybody who's going to watch these videos. And I'm going to put the homework assignment out on X. I get it. It's a 3-hour commitment to like listen to 3 hours of video. Watch it on 1.5 speed or 2x speed or whatever you need to. Or if there's just something that's top of mind that you haven't heard us speak about yet, maybe we have spoken about it, that you want us to address, like we'll dig into it. We're the whiteboarding guys. We're going to come to this table and we're going to bring in other people hopefully next week to help us talk about these things and do some more of this type of whiteboarding. And I think the cool thing is just, I've got a lot of experience talking to the enterprise space, spending time in the Web3 space, deep in the biz dev side, helping people discover solutions. And you've spent a number of years like practically solving some things on the hardware problem, on some primitive level things, which is what I love to do. I love to get into the primitives. Like for me, it's about how do we create primitives? How do we compose those and create composables? And how do we solve actual use case problems, right? How do we solve actual problems? And so I did that in telco. And I think that's the kind of blend that we have here is like you're actively solving something with a bunch of really cool solutions. I've seen a lot of problems. And my question is, how do we map what you're doing and what we're doing at Tashi with a lot of those problems that I've seen? And I think we can bring more people into, bring both sides of that, bring both perspectives.
Yeah, no,
I've seen problems that we can map onto and people who have seen solutions that can be mapped onto those problems.
And the reason I like this conversation, Ken, is like so much of our team actually came from something very similar to you, which is we all, came from, 20, 30 years plus of successful on the other side and going like the same problems you're speaking of. It was the same thing. We're like, I don't know how we get here without, and no one wants to do it. It's a pain. It's time consuming. It's a big bet because it's hard to pull off and you don't know if you're going to, but if you do, what you unlock is insane. So we just went, it's worth it. Like, actually, I told you this. The first thing we did was look around and go, is anyone else actually like solving at this level? And the answer was no. No one had gone the primitives all the way down to the bare metal, like that. You know what I mean? Like where there was nothing left type of thing. And then started to go there. But the first thing we did was like, man, it'd be nice if someone else was doing this so that we could start from their primitives up and build what we want to, but it wasn't there. And so now we found ourselves in a 5-year tornado of working through these things. And the reality is like, we're not going to sit here and say that we've got everything right. I think we have the right minds to work through it, to come up with concepts, try them, test, break it, rebuild it, right? Do it again and work through it. And we have the right minds that have been there, that have the history of, again, some of the first principles of the internet all the way back to the origination, and kind of going like, here's a chance for a do-over. And if you did that, what would you do?
Yep.
If you could.
Well, and I will tell you, in writing software, no software have I taken to production without rewriting it at least 5 times.
Yeah, sure.
Because you learn stuff along the way. And I think this is a much bigger problem, that we've learned stuff over the last 200 years.
Yeah.
And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, listen, it's been really 20 years, 25 years since our last real innovation, right? The internet came with a whole bunch of cloud stuff and new technologies that kind of fit into that space. So it's been about 20 years since we've had any major, step innovations with regard to the problems we're trying to solve. And so I think it's about time for us to have that next major step.
I do too. And then I actually truly believe that things like Web3 can step into its full fulfillment. Like these will be very important primitives and building blocks for it to take the leap that we're all, I think to your point, many are sensing and feeling and kind of being like, there's something here, but why won't this square peg fit in the round hole?
Right. Yep.
Why won't it work, right? And it's like, we let's take a step back. Let's go back, to some of these other things, and then see if that corrects it going forward, or maybe it's not correct it, but at least takes us another step forward. Even that is an advancement. Yep. All right, Ken. Well, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm sure we'll talk this
Likewise.
week because we do, but certainly next week, and we'll figure out polls on. It sounds like what process, as well as maybe some topics.
That sounds amazing. Thanks for joining. We'll see everybody next week. It's the same time every week, Tuesday, noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. We look forward to having you there. If you don't see the actual link next week, because we're going to try this new live stream mechanism, then I would just say be ready for the noon and look for the announcement when we hit the live stream button. And we'll see you on X live stream, but YouTube is always a safe place. I always post the link a few days in advance. So if you want to set a reminder there, that's probably helpful. So again, thanks everybody for joining, and we will see you next week. Cheers.